some people have the attitude that the less I put in there, the less I'm going to be liable. But I can't encourage airplane owners enough. I run into this day in, day out where get your records complete. Keep them in one place together. I see this happening all the time. I get a plane in and I'm working. Where's the engine logbook? Oh, it's not in there? No. Hold on. A day later, I found it on my desk. I said, you need to keep this all together in one packet.
Yeah.
I'm John.
I'm Jeff.
And this is Keep Those Props Turning. Perspectives and insights to keep you flying, not grounded.
Hey, Jeff.
Yeah, good morning.
Morning. Hey, logbooks. It's one of those things that when we get engines into signature, it's always a struggle. And I don't know exactly why, but there seems to be a lot of confusion about what needs to be in logbooks, what entries need to be there, and what needs to be notated. So I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about really what I see as three types of logbooks. And there's obviously the logbook for the pilot. That's his or her flights,
right?
Where they've gone, the conditions that they've flown under, whether it's VFR, IFR, a different airport that they've gone to. It tracks basically their history and experience. Nighttime flying obviously is important. So that to me is really a personal logbook of their journeys in whatever aircraft they've been in. The two that I see that seem to get really messed up are the logbook for the airframe, potentially also the prop, but we'll focus on the airframe right now, airframe and engine. They're really two separate sets of entries. And for us, obviously, the most important is the engine logbook, which should document things like maintenance performed, checks that have been performed on it as far as ADs, compliance, reoccurring being every so many hours or every so many months, years, another inspection or replacement of something has to happen. And that's really chronological. But the other side of it is based on time. And, when we take a look at logbooks, it seems like things get really muddled up and people get very confused about how to make proper entries. And I see engines where they'll put in there, engine was removed, engine was reinstalled. Big red flag there. What we oftentimes will say to the owner is, what happened? I don't know. I bought the aircraft and that was in there. To me, that's a really big red flag because that engine was removed for some reason. Was it a prop strike? Did it make metal? Did it have some sort of major issue that required it to be removed? Or did they potentially remove the engine and put a different one in? We'll see that as well, where people just take and copy from the prior entry, the serial number, the make of the engine, the model of the engine. They don't even look at the data tag, and we get an engine in that isn't what's supposed to be in that airframe. Somebody swapped it out.
Right.
So what are your thoughts on logbook entries, especially around engines?
Well, just my day-to-day kind of work, I do a lot of pre-buy inspections on aircrafts, which means I look through hundreds of logbooks. And you can imagine a 1960s vintage airplane, it might have 4 airframe logbooks, and then you get into the mire of an engine logbook, which it may have the original engine on it, never overhauled from 1960 or 70, or it might be a current overhaul, but yet it still carries on its old logbooks, which it shouldn't be there. But like you referenced about ADs and things like that, sometimes you get a very well-documented airplane with a very well-documented engine with AD lists and a file containing those lists and anything that was done to that engine, 8130 forms, say a cylinder was changed, things like that. But then more times than not, you get a lot of these logbooks like you described where, one of the big red flags I run into is you see an engine and prop or just a prop being replaced. And you're thinking, okay, what happened here? But you might see a prop being replaced, but nothing done to the engine, where if it had a sudden stoppage, as you know, it needs to have inspection done to some degree.
I mean, that's, I think, really the important thing for a pilot and an owner of an aircraft to make sure that his or her mechanic and whoever's working on anything relative to the airplane puts in there why, what occurred, or what is required, and this is why we're doing this, replacing the prop or overhauling the prop governor. What drove that decision to take that mechanical action, if you will?
I think I can tell you a lot of it is due to an owner possibly insisting the mechanic don't really document what really happened. They're trying to cover up. And as an inspector myself, you can kind of see the red flags and the trail of what happened, but it won't be documented in the logbook. It'll just say engine was removed for inspection or overhaul. Nothing to the effect of, like you said, why. And you can kind of read between the lines at that point. And so when I get back to a potential buyer, it's like, well, this engine there was a prop strike somewhere, I think, or damage to it, just like with the engine or the airframe. But as an owner of an aircraft or a potential owner, I always tell people, when you talk to your mechanic about an annual inspection, insist on having them generate an AD list and have them, line by line, sign off each one, making sure that he's inspected those. Because so many times I see the old, especially prior to 2000, a lot of these log entries are handwritten. They're very hard to read, and they're faded. There's coffee stains on them and oil stains, but they just say something simple like a general catch-all, all ADs complied with. And I look at that and I go, right away I distrust it. But so much these days we've got these automated systems where you can check the engine and it'll run a complete list of all the ADs that are possibly involved there. And as a mechanic and an inspector, you should be going through those and double checking those. Now, there's always the case too where a mechanic like myself, I've looked at a plane, say, for 5 or 10 years, and I've run an AD list 2 years prior and negated all the one-time only ADs. But there's always recurring ADs, and you should still run a list of the recurring ADs and sign off that, hey, I inspected these each and every year, or whatever time limit or calendar limit there is on it or requirement. So,
and ADs get updated.
That's correct.
Mandatory service bulletins get updated.
That's right.
Things change over the years and decades that are involved in these aircraft being around.
That's right. And just in the last 5 years, we've had a lot of ADs pop up with Lycomings that I can think of that, and it's another good reason why your mechanic and inspector should be looking at those and running a list every year just to make sure there's nothing new. Now, okay, I know some...
And those ADs are really relative to things that happened 10, 15, 20 years ago.
That's right.
Which is where the rub comes in for a lot of owners, is that historical information about what was done or the maintenance performed on the engine or even the overhaul isn't in there. It isn't complete.
That's right.
So then they're left with the compromise in the AD, if you will, that says, okay, you have to do this type of testing or reoccurring inspection if you can't validate something. So that's why it's really important to have that information with, if you will, in your records. And actually that's a point I want to make here, is that you're required to retain these records. That is the obligation of the owner. And when you're flying the aircraft, having logbooks in the aircraft are required. However, the supporting documentation, just like you mentioned, the list of ADs and the part numbers and all that, you don't have to have that with you. And in fact, we recommend to people keep either photocopies of your logbook entries in the aircraft, or keep the entries and then make copies of those and keep those in a safe place along with all the original supporting documents that identify the parts used, what was replaced, the serial numbers, the traceability, because so much of what we see all the time is really driven around not just what the manufacturer and the engine, but what is the part, what's the part number, what's the lot number, what were the installation dates. All those things become critical to decide whether this applies to your aircraft and your engine, or whether or not you have to take corrective action.
Yeah, it's a good point that you mentioned. A lot of times with engine overhauls, for instance, a lot of that documentation on parts is not in the logbook. The manufacturers or overhaulers like yourself, they have a complete folder of that information. And more times than not, I have the owner of the airplane. I'm asking them, okay, do you have any other further documentation on this overhaul? Because I have to go back and research when this overhaul was done exactly and what parts were used because of that AD that comes up. And they'll finally, oh, yeah, I've got that. And I was like, you need to keep this all together. And then when you bring it for annual, have it all in a packet. Most airplanes, they keep everything in a big, container or case or whatever.
Briefcase, yeah.
And okay, it takes a little time to sift through all the garbage that's in there because 90% of it doesn't need to be in there, but people just keep it. We're all pack rats. But yeah, it helps me as a mechanic and an inspector go, okay, this engine was annual or overhauled rather in 2000 whatever. Okay, and here's the parts they used, and I can go back and reference that against the AD. Whereas most of the time, those aren't available, or the parts that are under the AD aren't listed. You're familiar with that. I'm trying to remember the AD from about 2024 about the bronze bushings in the crank rods. And I think it was a time frame from 2009 to 2015. Well, most of the time, good luck finding which bushings somebody used. But fortunately, they gave you an out where they said, "Oh, inspect the oil each oil change and look for bronze."
But that's still a pain because if you
is.
had the documentation,
Yeah, that's
then it would
right.
be
You
clear.
could put not applicable.
Right.
And
But I think it's critical that when somebody does an annual or they're selling the aircraft, they have all those records together. As a pilot, I always look at it and say, I want to keep what I need to in the aircraft to be compliant when I'm flying, but I don't want to have everything in the aircraft. I have people that bring in big boxes, big briefcases full of stuff, and they fly with it all the time. The problem there is if it gets stolen.
that's right. You should never have that in the plane.
If it gets damaged for some reason, now you're scurrying to try and recover. And yes, you can do it electronically. Yes, you can make photocopies, all that. But the original records really should be kept in a safe place.
That's correct.
And as minimal as possible for safe flight should be with you. But when you come to the annual, when you come to selling that aircraft, make sure you have all that. You brought up the point about owners oftentimes will push, let's put as little in as possible. I agree. It's one of those things where when we see that, there's always a big red flag and a lot of unknowns. I always talk to people about the fact that when something happens or if you have to take corrective action to deal with something that occurred, it's better to document it and show in the records that you've taken the appropriate corrective action, inspections, repairs, replacement that's required. Because with aircraft, your liability for what was done, what you authorized, does not go away when you sell the aircraft. There's something called vicarious liability, and it can go back 3, 4, 5, 10 owners before that if somebody improperly or incompletely documented something or they didn't take the proper corrective action, the liability will fall back on them, even though they haven't owned the aircraft in 10, 15, 20 years.
That's right. Yeah, I think it's maybe partly the mechanic's fault. Some people have the attitude that the less I put in there, the less I'm going to be liable. But I can't encourage airplane owners enough. I run into this day in, day out where they're just not organized. And, get your records complete. Keep them in one place together. I see this happening all the time. I get a plane in and where's the engine logbook? Oh, it's not in there? No. Hold on. A day later, I found it on my desk. I said, you need to keep this all together in one packet.
Yeah.
That way you know where everything is, because it's going to affect your resale if you go to sell the plane, if you don't have something there. And like I said, and you made a great point about as long as, damage happens, but as long as an inspector or mechanic, we look at it and see, okay, it's been corrected, it's been taken care of properly. Okay, red flag goes away. Engines, we have prop strikes all the time. Doesn't mean the engine's bad. It gets torn open.
It only means it's bad if it wasn't addressed properly.
That's right. If you leave it carry on, it could be catastrophic.
My old joke to everybody is, it's not what's in the logbook that should scare you. It's what's not.
That's right.
And when you start finding holes in this cheese, if you will, then you got Swiss cheese and you got a lot of blanks and a lot of question marks.
That's right. And you see it. You can see it if you look at enough logbooks like I do. You can spot it right away, and you're like, this doesn't look quite right. But when you right away, your first impression, when you see somebody that has all the information contained in one packet or a container, you go through it and you see, there's a folder for ADs. Every year they've done. Right away, you get a good feeling that this airplane's been maintained properly. Yeah, it's been maintained properly.
Right.
Otherwise, if it's all just handwritten and you see a lot of owner entries, and things, you're like, let's see how bad this is. This first thought you have, all right, how bad is this thing going to be?
Well, and as the owner and even the pilot, they should take a look at the latest entries that are made. And it should be clear to them, what did we do? How did we deal with it? When was it done? And they should have awareness, not just take the logbook back from whomever gave it to them and stick it away and go, well, I'm assuming it's right. I'm assuming that's what was supposed to be done. There needs to be an awareness, because you're still, as the pilot, the pilot in command, you're responsible for making sure that the proper maintenance, the proper inspections have been done on the aircraft before that next flight and any subsequent flights.
That's right. And as an inspector, the last sign-off counts. I've had instances where I've had to hand planes back to a customer because, sometimes, these guys are, I'm not saying they're bad mechanics, but they take on these jobs, and those airplane engines aren't that complicated. But you come in and you go, what's going on with these two cylinders? They look new. Oh, well, I changed them out. You did it yourself. Yeah, well, I can't sign off on that. Well, why not?
Right.
And they don't understand that, hey, you're not legally allowed to do that kind of work.
Right.
But you run into that time and time again.
But there are things they're allowed to do.
That's
Oil
correct.
Changes, general inspection of
Correct.
condition. And I even tell people, you're allowed to remove cylinders. You're allowed to remove the engine from the aircraft.
That's right.
You
You just can't
cannot put it back
on.
in
Right.
without a appropriate signed off FAA registered person signing off it was done properly and the proper techniques and everything else that's necessary. So we want them to be involved.
Well, that's right. But the end result is, though, I can't guarantee how that part was put back on the plane. And if I sign off on it, I'm saying that everything's okay. It's my responsibility at that point. And whoever put it on can just walk away going, I don't know anything about it.
Right.
So it's really about, responsibility and liability that, and like you said, you might see an airplane where there's an STC for a different engine, a higher horsepower engine, but there's nothing to back up. It just says engine was changed out, but there's no STC documentation or anything on it. And you've got to say, well, where is it? And I can't sign this off.
Well, and that goes back to everything is fine until it's not.
Mm-hmm.
And when something goes wrong, everything's called into question. When records are not accurate, things are not properly documented or maintained, then everybody, insurance, FAA, the banks, you name it, all get involved and start questioning everything. So it's better to keep things above board, very clear as to why they were done, why it was performed, when it was done. All of that becomes very critical. And keeping those records is the responsibility of the owner. The pilot, who may be a different individual, is responsible for making sure that the records are there and accessible if needed.